Great, thanks for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be here. And it's simple, and it's salt. This is a new experience for me to be in an institution like this, although I must say, like, my interests have been at the intersection of cities and technology, emerging technology, and to be in a community of artists and visual artists who've always been at the forefront of exploring new technology, particularly in cities. I've engaged with that community for a very long time. I've written in media arts journals for 10 or 15 years. I've gone to conferences and things like that. So that dialogue is really rich, and I've been involved in it. So it actually is a really normal place to be. And I was at SALT with the new museum 4 years ago. I can't even remember the name of the event. What was it called? Do you remember? Idea City. Yeah, Idea City. So this is part of a continuing conversation, which is cool. This is also a very new thing for me because I'm not really talking about my academic / professional work. This is a new project I'm working on. It's a creative project. What I've been doing for the last 20 years, again, as an academic, as an activist, as a community organizer, and as a consultant, as an advisor, is helping a whole bunch of different kinds of institutions, whether it's companies, governments, developers, understand what internet technology means for cities and how they can create value from it, and how they can manage the risks that are associated with it. Whether that means making transportation work better or making public space more interactive, more engaging, more valuable. And that culminated in a book that I published in 2013 called Smart Cities. And that book was really about how all these players, from companies to governments to architects, designers, and even everyday citizens, increasingly, can use the internet to help redesign cities. And that was what they call in the business serious nonfiction. That's what the publishers call it. Nonfiction, because it's about the real world, and serious to distinguish it from, say, things that Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton would publish, which, or even what's the guy's name? The guy with the hair. Malcolm Gladwell, the guy who sells all the books. If you ever go into an airport, he's the one that sells all the books. He sells more books than all other nonfiction writers put together, which is really remarkable. But they're actually pretty good books. So seriously, I'm working on a new book, and this is a novel. This is fiction. This is not nonfiction. And the reason I'm doing this is because the first book and everything I've ever done, was from the mind. It was kind of the eyes to the mind, analytic thinking, observing facts, synthesizing, and regurgitating, kind of reductive or synthetic process. But there was a lot of stuff that came up that went a different way. It went through the heart and it came out. And some of that, I reacted to. There are a lot of things when you deal with technology that don't feel right. When a computer makes a judgment and then someone gets sentenced based on a computer's recommendation, or a computer figures out a credit score and then someone either gets a loan or doesn't get a loan based on a computer's credit score. Or a censor locks someone out based on some judgment. And those things feel wrong, and then, the logical side of you can go and reason why that's right or wrong. But there's a bunch of stuff that came up in writing the book that I could never really find my way to a rational point of view on. And so there's still a lot of things lingering, and I think there's a lot of value in that more emotional kind of way of investigating the world that I wanted to explore. So this book, I'm more exploring kind of urges and emotions and feelings rather than like thought and reason. And I think that's the way, novelists explore the world. I'm still writing about cities. I think we all know that cities are growing. They're taking over the planet. I'm not going to cite the fact that all urbanists use at the beginning of every presentation, that the world's population is going from 50% urban in 2005 to 70% urban by 2050, 90% urban by 2100. I'm not going to cite that because that's at the beginning of every urban presentation, although it's true. So we're going from a world of about 6 billion urban dwellers to 8 by the end of the century. One thing that people don't realize is that urban population is mostly coastal and becoming increasingly more coastal. So if you are a city dweller, you probably live by a coast within, I think, about 50 miles. By the end of the century, you will almost certainly live in a coastal area. So, you live near water if you're a city dweller. I grew up on the coast, and my life's always been lived near water. I did this once. I made a map. I went on Google Maps, and I mapped every home I've ever lived in. And I'm kind of ashamed to say this, but I think I'm up to like 45 different places I've lived now for more than a month. And like every one of them, when you zoom in to a mile, there's like some large body of water nearby. It's maybe a river, it's a bay, it's something, but there's always water in that picture. It's like this kind of like constant looming thing in my life. But the thing, that this is almost every single day on the front page of the New York Times now, is that our coasts are threatened, right? So this is the one tangible, unarguable fact of climate change. If you don't believe anything else, any of the other evidence, which can be argued scientifically, the coasts are threatened. And without getting into it too much about whether it's happening or not, you have to dial back whatever you know about climate change and imagine yourself explaining it to like your grandmother or an illiterate person from a poor developing country. Just what a difficult concept. How much you have to have learned in school to understand even what climate is, let alone climate change, right? And climate as distinct from weather. Okay, so like when I hang out with my mother, every single day when the sun goes down, my mother, with great surprise, pulls a sweater on and says, "Oh, boy, it gets chilly when the sun goes down." And every day I look at her and I'm like, do you have short-term memory loss? Like, it got chilly yesterday. It got chilly the day before when the sun went down. It got chilly every one of the tens of thousands of days that you've been alive when the sun went down, right? It gets chilly. The sun provides heat, which keeps the air warm during the day. And when the sun goes down, it gets cold. And like, there's a dynamic system that you live in, and it creates weather. So she knows this, but she forgets it every day. And this is multiplied 10,000 times over. This is the problem that we have with just understanding simple yet very complex behaviors of this thing we have called an atmosphere. So I don't mean to make fun of my mother, but that's what we're dealing with in terms of understanding these things. So that's just like how our body reacts with this thing around us. Then go from our basic surroundings to weather, from weather to climate, from climate to global climate change, okay? Then from how my behavior impacts global climate change, and you start to see how complicated it is. Then go from that to how global climate change impacts specific severe weather events, and you start to see how complicated and how difficult it is to actually link anything. But the one thing that you can definitely point to, there's incontrovertible evidence, every year the ocean gets a little bit higher because the polar ice caps are melting. You can stick a yardstick in the ground, the water's coming up. This is a fact. So you have these two things, right? You have cities are getting bigger, faster. We're building them. We're building them along the coasts. That's a fact. It's literally a concrete fact. And the sea level's coming up. And they're happening in the same place. They're literally rushing at each other. The kind of cliche about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. That's what's happening. And that's really what it is that I'm trying to get my head around with this book. Now you go to cities around the world, the ones that are really starting to grapple with this head on, places like Miami, places like Venice, places like London, places like Amsterdam, they're starting to feel it. Miami literally, the clock is ticking in southern Florida. It will be underwater in a matter of decades if something pretty radical isn't done soon. And what really kind of, kicked this into high gear for me was what happened in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy in New York, which really literally flooded the entire New York Harbor, including the town that I live in New Jersey, which, in the words of our mayor on the news during the flooding, filled up like a bathtub. This is something that, the more I thought about it, the floodwaters kind of went away. This became like kind of an all-encompassing fear for me. The more I thought about it, I think it really caught me by surprise how quickly the people around me, once the flood subsided, I expected like the real estate market to crash and people to start moving away from the coast, and life went totally back to normal. And literally, like I remember looking at like housing price charts for the town I live in, and literally the whole town was underwater, and there wasn't even like a blip. It's not a single week where house prices didn't continue to go up unabated, and I found the whole thing like really jarring. And I don't know if it was a rational reaction, but like I started to really develop this kind of existential angst, and it really took me over. And I almost felt like writing this book was like a form of therapy. So the working title for the book is it's kind of a I don't know if it's a cliche or what, but it's the title is Mean High Water. And there's kind of like an embedded thing in there, like the high water, being the high water mark, and mean, this is sort of I'm characterizing the ocean as the antagonist in the story, but mean high water is actually the oceanographer's technical term for the high water line, being the average high water, the high tide line. And really, the point of the book is to try to focus on the changing relationship between us, the climate, cities, and the coast. And so, like this is a picture of people in Wuhan, in China, kind of tiptoeing, over the water. I look at them and I think, they're kind of like trying to get by, trying to hoping maybe like that the ocean doesn't notice that they're still trying to maintain their toehold on the land that it's trying to reclaim, and I really empathize with that. I think they're not ready to surrender yet, but I don't know if they're fully aware that like this is kind of an inevitable process, and this is the thing that I'm grappling with is are they deluding themselves? Is this is the surrender inevitable? And that's really what I'm trying to explore here. So to me, the book is really about these four C's: cities, coasts, and climate change. And I'll tell you about the fourth one in a second. So one of the things that happened after Sandy in New York was most of the public kind of went back to life as normal. The urban planners, on the other hand, saw this as like a growth industry, and they launched into this giant, like years-long debate that was really gut-wrenching about how they were going to respond to climate change and rising sea levels. And in a lot of ways, it was very similar to what happened after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks when the World Trade Center was destroyed. And it was this kind of like, how are we going to rebuild our wounded city? Very like navel-gazing kind of exercise, which I personally was really disappointed by the results, and a lot of others were as well. What we've gotten are these really unremarkable towers and a very expensive, underwhelming train station that Sergio Calatrava designed. What this one's really produced is a kind of earnest but pretty hollow and I think not very rigorous debate about what we now call resilience. But what's intrigued me about it, especially coming off Smart Cities, is that there's a really powerful new voice in the debate. And it's a voice that's gaining power every day. It's a voice that no one really understands because no one knows how it thinks. And no one really understands what its intentions are. And no one understands those intentions because no one really knows if it has any intentions. And of course, this is the fourth C, and this is computers. Computers are playing an incredibly important role in this debate because they're essentially being used to provide a kind of aura of scientific certainty about the rate of change and the consequences of change that are giving planners the authority to decide what interventions are valid and which ones are not, and to give them the authority to act. So how did we get started talking about resilience in the first place? Well, basically we got on the phone, we got on planes, went around the world and looked for advice. And I think one of the strangest things that happened in New York was the first thing we did was basically go to the two colonial administrators, the two former colonial powers. We went to the English and the Dutch and asked them, what do you do about flooding? Because the Dutch have been doing this for generations, and the English have been blocking, the Thames for the last 10 years with the Thames Gate. Now, I don't know if this was like a really fair comparison, because the North Sea, like keeping the North Sea out versus keeping a Category 5 Atlantic hurricane out is kind of like this much water and this much water. But I guess it was somewhere to try. So thinking about resilience planning, the way this works into the book is that there's a hearing in the waterfront town, and basically the idea is that I wanted to work this in essentially. I wanted to take what's happened in New York and basically try to abstract it into like a model city of resilience, basically, and to take all the things about what's going wrong with the resilience debate in New York and highlight them in a fictional setting. So we've had things happen in the New York area like wealthy waterfront homeowners fighting against flood barriers because they don't want to have to look at them and have them block their view of the waterfront. So people fighting government-subsidized flood barriers that will protect their own property because they don't want it interfering with their access to the waterfront. To me, that's like a total breakdown of society when something like that happens. Yet they support subsidized flood insurance. We've had I mean, just terrible, terrible things happening. So, there's just kind of like an unending series of these things. This is something that I spent a lot of time, obviously, working on in smart cities. And one of the things that really, really shaped my thinking very deeply was a book that was written in 1994 by David Gerlinter at Yale. And Gerlinter was kind of an eccentric figure. He's a bit of a right-winger, bit of a Zionist, which is totally beside the fact, would be beside the fact, except that he was actually one of the Unabomber victims. Ted Kaczynski sent him a mail bomb and blew off half his hand and blinded him in his right eye. And no one knows why exactly, whether it was his politics or his writing, because his writing was really his writing about computers was quite provocative, and it was particularly this one book, Mirror Worlds. And Mirror Worlds was basically a book about big data about 20 years before anybody called it big data. And Mirror Worlds was basically describing the world that we live in now, a world where everything is tracked, everything can be mapped, and those maps move in real time. So like Waze, right? An app that takes millions of reports from people about where traffic is happening and how fast people are moving and where the cops are and where the accidents are, and lets us see it all at the same time. And Gerlinter had this really interesting word for that. He called it topsight. And essentially topsight was, he used it to differentiate the kind of knowledge you could get, or the point of view you could get from all that data, from having access to a mirror world, a computerized viewpoint of a big set of data. He differentiated it from insight, which is what you get when you zoom into the detail. And topsight allowed you to see the big picture. And what was really interesting, there were a bunch of really interesting things about the book, but the two really relevant things for this discussion was that every time he talked about why you would want to build a mirror world, why you would want to build a computer that could suck in all this information about the world and then show you the topsight, he always went to cities as the example for why you would want to do that. He would always say like a traffic jam, or you want to see a delivery system at work, or you want to see whatever. Always cities for why you'd want to see such a complex viewscape. And then the second weird thing is that he always, every time he talked about making a mirror world, he would talk about how dangerous and evil such a thing would be. And in the last chapter of the book, he sets up this like really weird, it's like this epilogue at the end of the book that's this conversation between two of his alter egos who are like walking through the woods outside Yale, and they're yapping on about like, basically, they're having a debate about romantic thought and Enlightenment thought. And they're like, one of them's like, but what about romantic thought and like being alive and feeling and this and this and that? And the other one's like, no, but you can know everything and you can predict and da-da-da-da-da-da, and you'll be able to have complete certainty and never be afraid of the dark and da-da-da. And this one's like, but when will the magic be and blah, blah, blah. And, basically he concludes that building these things is going to crush like beauty, essentially. I mean, that's like what he comes down to. And if you don't build these things, you'll be destroyed. Anyone that doesn't have these things will be crushed. And it's kind of a really scary conclusion. And essentially what it's saying is the world is going to get caught up in an analytical arms race. Like anyone who does not build these tools for understanding the flow of data will not be able to succeed and will be outgunned by everybody else in the world. What's really intriguing about how this has kind of developed is that you've seen like the art world start to pick up on some of this visually and see like mirror worlds bleeding out into the physical world. And this is what James Bridle calls the new aesthetic, which I think was coined like 4 or 5 years ago. And this is essentially like visual representations from the digital world bleeding over into the physical world. I think this is like a really incredibly superficial trope, I guess is the best way of describing it. It's because it says absolutely nothing about the mechanisms that are at work here. It's like purely, I mean, it is what it says it is, so I guess it's okay for that. But you know, it's really just pixels. It's like fetishizing pixels for what they are, and saying that like because the digital world uses pixels to represent things, when we see pixels in the physical world, oh, cool, that's the digital world mapping itself into the physical world. Boy, isn't that exciting. What I think is a lot more interesting is when we see things happen in the physical world because of processes that are happening inside computers that are making them act. So, you know, if this drone actually like blew something up because something happened inside a piece of software, I think that's a lot more interesting than you know, seeing a picture of a drone. But anyways, let me see if I can start to tie some of these things together. This is the problem with work in progress, is it's just fragments of stuff. It makes sense in my head, and we'll hopefully pull a couple of these things together. But so the main point of this, and there's some other representations of this that are get a little bit more to this point. I think the picture of the umbrella might do this a little bit more. The main, I think, meaning of the new aesthetic, some other images of this, like what pictures of like what machine vision algorithms see, like when a computer looks at a face and tries to understand whose face it is that computers see, and they have a special way of seeing. So computers have a way of seeing the world that's different than how you and I see the world. That's the important message from the new aesthetic. So that's nice. Computers see the world, right? And they see the world differently than we do. So to try to connect those two things up, mirror worlds, the way I've described them, are computers' ways of seeing the city. And it's different than the way we see the city. So I think that makes sense. So in urban planning, we're now using these mirror worlds every day. And we have a very bland name for them. And it's a name that was particularly chosen on purpose to be bland, so that you, if you ever find out what we call them, will not think that we let them make the decisions. We call them decision support tools, not decision-making tools. Because we never, ever, 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 ever want you, if you're a journalist, one of those pesky, meddling journalists, to think that they make the decisions. We make the decisions. Actually, the mayor makes the decisions. We're the decision support tools for the mayor. It's very important that the software not make the decisions in government. But so this then raises a whole bunch of other questions. If this computer sees differently, okay, we know that it sees differently because that's not how I see. That much is obvious, right? If I also ask it to make sense of what it sees, okay, because this doesn't make sense to me. So if I ask it to understand this, summarize this for me, summarize it over time, summarize it by larger areas, by smaller areas, whatever, it's going to do that differently than I do, probably, okay? Is it going to do that differently than I do it? And how? If I ask it to predict something, so this is a predictive modeling as a whole area, is it going to predict differently than I do? These are questions that this thing, which is only asking about how computers see the world differently, never gets into, because these have nothing to do with analyzing or predicting. This is just about seeing. So seeing, analyzing, predicting. These are like different stages of insight, I guess. So I think this is like, if you look at what happened with something like aerial photography. When aerial photography came along, it completely changed the way cities were planned, because all of a sudden, people that planned and designed cities were looking at them from down instead of from the top of a hill or from inside. This is not just looking at a city from above, you're looking at a city from inside a computer, which can do all these things to it and can see it in all these different ways. So I think, and particularly the big change, is that this is a much more powerful way of predicting what will happen in the future. And we'll talk a little bit more about this before I stop torturing you. And I think this is the beginning of a path where we're definitely going to lose control, and this is going to go from decision support to decision making. This is where it starts to get really weird and scary. So the reason why I think this is happening, because computers aren't going to just do more of the thinking about the future for us. There's a couple different dimensions to this, right? So there's going to be a lot more thinking about the future, period. Because these machines are really good about thinking about the future. One of the things that one of the applications of computer modeling and big data and all this crap that you hear about, predictive analytics, right? This is something that is big business now. It's something that companies are selling a lot of software. There's an awful lot of software being sold in the urban world to do this, particularly in the environmental systems climate change world, particularly in the coastal climate change systems world. There's a lot more of this going on, and whether it's useful is an open debate. Second, it's getting better. So I just contradicted myself, but that's what happens when you're writing a first draft. And it's getting demonstrably better. Okay, so the science is improving. But here's the creepy part, and that's kind of what the diagram is supposed to show. And this is the big but. Okay, there's this thing with predictive modeling, machine learning models. It's called interpretability. Okay. So last year, I was listening to this talk by a brilliant mathematician at MIT, a young woman named Cynthia Rudin. And here's the sentence that really kind of sent me reeling. So she said, "For years now in the machine learning business, we've been selling black boxes that we put stuff in, and stuff comes out, and we don't know how it does it. We just know that it predicts." Okay. So this is what happens. This is what happens inside Google. This is what happens inside Facebook. This is what happens inside every company that makes money off advertising, off anything that says predictive. Okay. The predictive analytics models that are used in big data companies right now are so mathematically complicated that not only can no human being understand them, I mean, they literally have millions of variables. It can be mathematically proven that they cannot be understood. So not only can we not understand them, we know we will never be able to understand them. That's how complex they are. They work. They produce predictably good results, but we can't. They're fundamentally ununderstandable. And it's a really weird concept that they're unknowably good. Okay, just wrap your head around that. They're like enigmas. Okay, so one way of understanding them is that they're illegible, inscrutable. So just hold that in your head. There are other models that she calls interpretable models. Interpretable models mimic a human decision-making process. That's what this is. Okay? That looks really complicated. That's the simple version, right? So the reason she cares about this is that she builds models that computers use to help doctors analyze, to do medical diagnostics. So it's basically a piece of software that provides a second opinion on a medical diagnostic. And when the doctor says, I don't believe the computer can say, look at how I came to this conclusion. Here's my reasoning process. The illegible model can say, here's my million-row regression model that you'll never, ever, ever understand given all the time in the history of the universe. Which one would you trust, right? It's all about trust. It's about trusting the computer. So this is a really big deal because what it means is that we're moving into a world where we'll have to choose between models that we can trust, but may not be as good as the ones we don't know if we can trust, which may be more effective. That's a really weird choice to have to make, right? Okay, so back to the ocean, which is lurking menacingly in the background. This may be moot, right? So the ocean's a fickle thing. All this, if we don't get to a point where we can kind of nail down the coast to a point where we can define it clearly enough that the models can converge and we can actually force it and define it enough that the predictive models can say with some certainty that it's going to rise a certain amount in a certain period of time. And yes, we should evacuate New York, or we should resettle parts of Istanbul, although you have enough hills that you're probably good for a couple centuries. And we have to pick which one of these models do we trust? Which land use, which sea level rise prediction, and which land use model do we have to? This is where I grew up, which it doesn't matter which model you believe. This place is going to be abandoned. It's going to be underwater. It may not matter. It has to be evacuated. But still, I think for most coastal regions, they're going to be trapped in this, potentially, in this place where deciding whether or not to stay and how quickly or not they have to decide whether to bug out and whether it's a long goodbye, a somewhat hasty resettlement, or a rapid evacuation comes down to something as insane as which computer model they have and how much they trust it. So I think that's kind of crazy. And this all kind of brings me back to resilience. I'm really deeply, again, so I'm drawing on a lot of scientific ideas, but I don't think this is a scientific analysis. I'm drawing on these as kind of straw men in a plot that may go in some really weird directions. But I think I think this idea of shifting our field of view, because we're able to think about the future with different tools, and potentially allowing computers to hijack our responsibility to think about the future for us, is a huge risk. This whole idea of resilience I feel like when I read between the lines of what urban planners are saying to us, that's what they're saying. They're saying we should resilience is about seeing the future through what the computers tell us the future is going to be, and interpreting that better. And I don't think that's a good idea. It means trying to read the mind of what the computer is telling us. It means trying to interpret what those models are saying. And I think that's going to change us. And I really think that's just not, I don't think that's a great idea. So I'm just going to leave it there. Like I said, this is really, really early days for thinking about this. The reason for the weeds, I think resilience is just the wrong target. If you look at any example of what's the most resilient thing in any sector, it's the hardiest thing. It's the thing that survives the harshest conditions when all else has been destroyed. And it's the weed. It's the gang. It's the bank. It's the ruthless government. I don't know. It's not the beautiful thing. It's not the good thing. It's not the thing that creates lasting, social good and beneficial value. And I really feel like resilience is like a cynical aspiration. The more I think about it, I think it's really the wrong target. It's giving up. And as much as like the institutions like Rockefeller Foundation that have promoted it as like sustainability plus or like a stepping stone to sustainability, like we have to survive with resilience to get to sustainability. I think it's just like it's really giving up, and I just want to shoot for something better than that. So thanks. I appreciate the patience.